First, let me introduce our panelists from your left, my right. Moving on, first we have Abdelmonem Syed Ali, who is the director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. He's also a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis. He's coming from Egypt. Then we have Shai Feldman, who is the Judy and Sidney Swartz director of the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis, an Israeli who taught previously at Tel Aviv University and directed the Jaffe Center. And then finally, Khalil Shikaki, who is the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, that's in the West Bank, and who also is affiliated with the Crown Center at Brandeis. So all three of these gentlemen work at Brandeis and teach a course there together. It's obviously, as you can imagine, with an Israeli, an Egyptian, and a Palestinian all together teaching a course in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a very unique course, a unique opportunity for the students, and it's been so successful, actually, that they've published this book, which you all should have received. And I'll just say one small anecdote about this book. I'm at Princeton full-time doing a PhD in Near Eastern Studies, and last year we hired a professor of Israel Studies. And each time the candidates, the finalists would come and give a talk and have questions and answers, and there was somebody in the audience, a man named Daniel Kurtzer, who was a very distinguished American diplomat. He was the ambassador to Israel, he was ambassador to Egypt. He's also one of the more distinguished professors of Middle Eastern Studies at Princeton. And he asked every single candidate, are you aware of this book? Do you plan on using this book? Not that there was any sort of litmus test, because there wasn't, but it was a good sense to first know whether or not they were on top of their subject, because this is really the cutting edge of what's going on in the field, and also to get a sense of where they were, were they going to take a balanced approach, or were they going to try to bring in something else? And I think that sort of view, Ambassador Kurtzer's view, is shared in a lot of elite universities and a lot of departments of Middle Eastern Studies and Israel Studies across the country. So what you're going to get today is, I think, a version of Middle Eastern, of the Arab-Israeli conflict, how to teach it between Arabs and Israelis, that is being taught at elite universities like Princeton, Brandeis, really around the country and some places around the world. And I think we all stand to benefit a lot from that. So join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Sam. So this session will be different from all the previous sessions, in the sense that we're not going to focus on primarily on the conflict, or imparting on you more information about the conflict that you've already received, but really talking about teaching the conflict. Dealing with dilemmas that teaching the conflict raise. And so we'll just give you some three versions of our versions about what's involved, and hopefully really respond to the challenges that you face in dealing with this problem of how to teach this complicated conflict. So let me just, so what I'll do is kind of give an introduction that will give you hopefully some sense of how this book came about, how this project came about, and maybe a word or two about the challenges, the most important challenges that we faced in trying to do this. So the origins of this essentially is the origins of the center that we created just almost 10 years ago at Brandeis. And it has a personal dimension for all three of us. So for my part, I was at Tel Aviv University for 28 years, on and off in actually a think tank. I did relatively little teaching. I was basically involved in thinking mostly about defense policy, Israel's defense policy. I was originally a founding child of the first civilian think tank in Israel that dealt with defense affairs. It was then called the Jaffe Center. It's now called the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. So I've been dealing actually with Israeli policy, with defense policy, and I never thought of myself as an Orientalist or an expert on the region. The region was the object of our involvement. But I looked for a different life, and to cut a long story short, I agreed for that new life to be at Brandeis. However, when Brandeis approached me and asked me to create this new center of Middle East Studies called the Crown Center for Middle East Studies, I conditioned this on the university accepting my philosophy about such a center. And my philosophy about such a center was that the center has to be balanced and dispassionate. So that, if you can imagine graphically, every wall would have a graffiti on it called balanced and dispassionate, balanced and dispassionate. And the university actually accepted it because part of the rationale for creating the center was precisely to counter certain or to put it this way, address perceived biases in other centers of Middle East studies. And of course, you know, if you think that there are other centers in Middle East studies that are biased in one direction, there are two ways of addressing it. Create a center that's biased in the opposite direction, and I made it very clear that that's not my idea. And the other is to create a center that would be balanced and dispassionate. The university accepted that, and I said, okay, fine, now here's what it translates to. I have to, before we even begin, bring together with me some of my colleagues from the region. And they agreed. And so I essentially approached two colleagues with whom I've been working on and off in projects and in conferences, and we've known each other for a long time. Abdelmonem Said and I have known each other for more than 3 decades, and Khalil Shikaki and I have known each other and cooperated on many projects for maybe about 2.5 decades. And so I approached them with the idea that they would join the effort to create this new center at Brandeis. But of course, they were running their own centers, which in Cairo and in Ramallah. And this was not going to be, in their case, a substitute. It was going to be an addition to. And they agreed to give me 8 weeks every year from their time. And so we entered into this discussion about what content are we going to insert into this cooperation. And that's where we decided that the pillar of our cooperation would be to create this class that, as far as we knew, didn't exist in other colleges. The only class on the Arab-Israeli conflict that is team taught by an Israeli, a Palestinian, and an Egyptian representing a broader Arab perspective, so that the students can get a sense not of the competing narratives about the conflict, not just by reading whatever we're giving them to read in the syllabus, but by the fact that 2 of us are in class, every class. They can interact with us as we discuss with them the competing narratives. By virtue of the fact that they're discussing that 2 of us are in class, every class, they get a sense not only of the texts of the competing narrative, but also the texture of the competing narratives. And so about a year after we started teaching this class, to cut a long story short, somebody who came from the outside and attended our class said, this can't possibly remain in the confines of this class. There are only 25 students that are here, and this has to be placed at the disposal of a much larger constituency. So then I had to enter another set of negotiations. As you know, in the Middle East, we're very good in negotiating. And I've actually managed to get Khalil and Abdelmonem to give me another 6 weeks every year in the summer. They thought they were doing me a favor, and I thought I was doing myself a favor. But the result of their agreement was that we didn't understand that what we really were agreeing upon is to ruin 6 summers. So that was the end result. We ruined 6 summers, but the product was the textbook, which is now the only textbook that is co-authored by this kind of a trio. Now, essentially, as you'll see, all the chapters, it's a 13-chapter book, which is really built for a 13-week semester. And all the chapters have the same structure. The first third of every chapter is called main developments. And what it really means is this is the part of the history of the conflict that is not contested by the parties. And actually, a British scholar who came to one of the events that celebrated the publication of the book said something that we didn't think about, which is his comment was, wow, it's quite impressive. There's a whole third of every chapter of the history of this conflict that's not contested. And you know, we kind of didn't actually think about the fact that it is quite impressive. Of course, when we say this is a main development and it means that it's a part of the history that's not contested, it means it wasn't contested between Khalil, Abdelmonem, and myself. Okay? You know, obviously, it may be that some of what is in the main developments will be contested. Now, the second part is everything that is contested. So the second part of every chapter is then divided also into 3 parts. What was the Israeli narrative about what's contested? What's the Palestinian narrative about what's contested? And what are the broader Arab narratives that are about what is contested? And oftentimes there are competing Arab narratives. So not all Arab narratives are consistent, and there are issues on which Egyptian narrative or the Syrian narrative and the Jordanian narrative are very different from one another. For example, what happened during the crisis of 1970, so-called Black September, and so on. And one can see also that there are gaps between Arab narratives and the Palestinian narrative. So now this way of approaching this issue of competing narratives has 2 purposes. One is to sensitize students to the competing narratives. Also, to send the implicit message that all these narratives are equally legitimate. And of course, what we try to do, in a sense, to desensitize, we're trying to sensitize the students to these competing narratives, but we also try to desensitize the whole issue and to avoid explosions by promising the students in the first 15 minutes of the first class that what we are not going to try to do is to adjudicate the narratives. We are not the Supreme Court of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We are have not taken upon ourselves to tell the students which narrative is closer to what we think is the true story or not. So what we try to do is essentially tell the students, hey, you know, be aware of the fact that on each of these issues that is contested, here is what the competing narratives look like, and make up your own minds. Okay, if you want to do more research, here's where you can go, and so on, but we're not going to tell you. And that also means that when we approach the problem that all professors have, which is, hey, we need to grade these students, right? We tell the students, here's the essay topic. There is no right answer or wrong answer. Okay? The whole issue is your argumentation, how you build your argumentation, and so on and so forth. But there is no right or wrong answer to any of this. And of course, you know, as you look at the book, some of the sharpest divergences or gaps in the narratives are the very things that were discussed in the first 3 sessions. In fact, I would say that, and I think Anne actually mentioned that, you know, the new Israeli historians are kind of closing the gap, for example, on the narrative of what happened with the origins of the Arab refugees issue. Paradoxically, the widest gap that exists between Arab and Israeli narratives, particularly Palestinian and Israeli narratives, that you will find has to do with the mandate period, has to do with the role of the British. Okay? Because the Zionist narrative about this period is a narrative of betrayal. Okay? The British provided the Balfour Declaration, and they had what you Americans called buyer's remorse. Okay? And as of that point, there has been a constant stream of British retractions from the promise in all the white papers that limited immigration, that limited this, limited that. The Palestinian narrative is 180 degrees on this one, divergent from the Zionist or Israeli narrative. It's all about who allowed the Zionist movement to build the institutions that you just heard about. And where did these self-defense forces come from? Who trained them? First, Colonel Ort Wingate, who essentially taught the Haganah how to conduct counterinsurgency operations, and then the British Army that trained a generation of military officers that when the Arab invasion came in 48, there was in the nucleus of an Israeli defense forces that actually knew how to move conventional military formations, armor, artillery, air, and so on and so forth. So this is a classical example of an issue around which the gap between the narratives is 180 degrees or extremely wide. Okay, so the second purpose of the book is to provide, or the second part of the book is competing narratives. The third part of the book is intended to provide the students with a toolbox to explain the most important developments in the history of the conflict. A toolbox that they can then use today, a few years after we close the textbook, or 5 years from now. And the toolbox, like every good idea, is very simple. The toolbox basically says to students, to understand any development in the history of the conflict, you have to answer for yourselves 4 questions. First, what happened in the international arena that can explain this development in the history of the conflict? Second, what happened in the regional arena that can explain that development in the history of the conflict? Third, what happened in the domestic politics of the main protagonists that can explain what happened, that particular development? And the fourth is, what was the role of individuals? What was the role of primarily individual leaders that can explain why what happened happened? And let me just close by saying 2 things about all of this. One is about this toolbox, and the other is about the main challenge. I promised you that I'll say a word about the main challenges that we faced. The most interesting, I would say, aspect of this intellectual exercise is to see how, when you go from one main development in the history of the conflict to another, and especially if you contrast developments during, say, let's say 3 decades ago to developments in, say, the last few years, is how the relative weight of these 4 stratas, which is to say the global, the regional, the domestic, and the individual, change from development to development. So, for example, if you look at developments in the conflict in the 50s, say the Sinai-Suez War that was mentioned earlier, then clearly the 1950s, the Middle East is under the Cold War, the Soviet-US competition, the NATO-Warsaw Pact competition, the whole issue of the declining standing of France and Britain and the motivations that come from their kind of rearguard effort to maintain some sort of superpower standing, and so on and so forth, and the challenges they face. So basically, you could say in the 1950s, and of course it translates in 1958 to actually US military intervention in the region, in Lebanon, and kind of a half intervention in Jordan, and so on and so forth. This is an era in which you could say that one level of explanation, which is the global, tends to overall have more importance than other levels. Okay, so maybe a combination of the global and the regional. Compared to today, there's the Soviet-US competition is gone. And in fact, if you, again, now we will kind of make the line between analysis and narrative a bit murkier, but the narrative in many Arab quarters today is of American absence, okay? And the Soviet, of course, the Soviet Union is gone. So if you look at, if you try to understand developments in the region today, it seems like domestic developments, whether they're in Iraq, whether they're in Syria, whether they're in Palestine, whether they're in Israel, and the role of certain individual leaders, like Nasrallah and so on and so forth, tends to have greater importance than was the case in the 1950s. It doesn't mean, again, that leaders weren't important in the 50s and 60s, right? You cannot write the history of the 50s and 60s without recognizing forceful individuals like Abdel Nasser. So it only means all four factors are always at play here, but the relative weight changes from time to time, and it's a very interesting exercise to get students to think about. Let me just close by saying, in my view, what was most interesting aside from the personal, we'll talk about that later, but I would say that the biggest challenges that we faced had nothing to do with the fact that Khalil is a Palestinian and Abdelmonem is an Egyptian and I'm an Israeli. Abdelmonem will probably say, I'll kind of preempt him, to say, when we came to the analytical part, we actually forgot who is an Israeli, who is a Palestinian, who is an Egyptian. We were three political scientists who just happened to have been educated in some of the best universities that this country provides. So that was actually not the issue for us. The most difficult issue was to decide that something is a main development and not a narrative. That in fact, if we insert that if a sentence has the word because of, then it doesn't belong either in the main developments or in the narrative. It belongs in the analytical section. So a lot of the time, which is the reason why we ruined 6 summers, is simply going over the text over and over and over and over and just making sure that every sentence is in the right place, that a development is indeed something that is not contested, and that if there is some disagreement about this sentence, it doesn't belong in the main developments. It belongs somewhere in one of the competing narratives, and that if the sentence has an if-then character, right, that gives you a sense of cause and effect, okay, it belongs in the analytical section. And that's intellectually was a challenging project, but I hope that, again, that what we provided is a teaching tool that didn't exist before, particularly the fact that in one single volume, students can read side by side what were each of these competing narratives about the same important development. So I'll stop here. Khalil will follow me, and then Abdelmonem.
Thank you, Shai. Speaking of challenges, I face 2 challenges here. One is procedural. That is how to convey what I want to convey to you in 15 minutes. And this seems to me, at this point, just impossible. The second is how by the time I finish, you will not be a lot more depressed than you are already. So, back to the textbook. There are 2 themes that we have been conscious of throughout this process of writing the book. And in every chapter, students will find these 2 themes. One is, why is this conflict so difficult to resolve? The resilience of the conflict, and that, of course, leads us to ask questions like, what drives this conflict? So we hope students get something out of that. That is what drives this conflict. I'm sure they can use this for other conflicts as well. And the second question is, why was it possible at times to resolve some aspects of this conflict? And here, of course, we have then to address those incentives for the parties that led them at times to want to resolve the conflict. You've mentioned the Jewish character of the state as an incentive for the Israelis today, as you were finishing, right? And I can mention Palestinian nationalism, which Anne spoke about. Palestinians still want a two-state solution. They don't want the South African model. Well, that seems to me, at this point, to be basically perfect. Israelis want Jewish and democratic state, and Palestinians want independence and sovereignty. The three levels of analysis that we provide is because we ultimately really want to go beyond sensitizing the students to the various narratives. We want to go beyond alerting them to the need to distinguish between developments, reality, what happened, and what people thought had happened, what people told themselves about what had happened. We want to go beyond this so that students are able to analyze what happened and understand why it happened. So we give them the three levels of analysis. We do not tell them that one is more important than the other. They discover for themselves. At times, one is more important. A man named Sadat in 1977 changed a lot of things. Without this man, certainly things would have happened in a manner that is different than we know of. In 1993, Rabin and Arafat did something similar. But in 1991, the regional and international environment was a lot more important than the leaders. And in 1974, when the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, decided to adopt what it called the provisional program. This was the turning point for the Palestinians to move away from total liberation of the land to gradually move into the two-state solution. That actually happened because all three levels were highly significant. The international regional environment was really pushing on the Palestinian side. Domestic developments, and particularly in the West Bank and Gaza, were pushing the Palestinians, the PLO. And without Arafat, this would not have happened. Definitely, it would not have happened. Okay. So, close your eyes. Imagine that you go home, turn your TV on, and it says Palestinians and Israelis have just agreed on a permanent settlement. How many of you believed me? None. Right. So I'm not going to take this scenario now with you. I'll take a more realistic one. The more realistic scenario is that within 2015, the Palestinian Authority will collapse, and the peace process will more or less evaporate. Right? More realistic. All right, so let me try to take you then through the steps. Sam, are you taking note of how much time I'm spending already? Thanks.
You have 2 minutes.
So said the third speaker. why a year from today the PI collapsed. Imagine we are not we're in the future. The book essentially tries to go back and analyze the reasons why this event that will happen in the future. So now, the book is really not about prediction, but that's what I'm trying to do. Tries to make it more difficult for us by looking at something that might happen. Of course, it's a lot easier to look at the past and try to analyze it. With hindsight, we know a lot of things that are yet to happen in this case that I'm looking at. And the scenario that I've just abandoned could very well happen, unlikely, as it might be, but who knows? I mean, maybe the US administration decides tomorrow that it does want to put ideas at the table, and it intends to leverage whether the Israelis and the Palestinians like it or not, and that it will not take no for an answer. The US actually did that in the past. And the reason I didn't select this scenario is because I think this administration is not going to do that. What would be developments in the case of the depressing scenario, the PI collapse? Well, I tried to jot down a few developments. But these developments, of course, have to be today's developments. Right? So it would remind the students of what happened with the efforts that started last year and the collapse of the Cairo mission, the failure of the US to really press the parties, despite all the progress that the Secretary of State made. When the moment came for him and for the president to press the parties, really put the framework at the table, make it public, bring them to Washington, and inform them that the US intends to use all the leverage it has to make sure that this happens. The US decided it's not for it. If the parties don't want it, why should we be the one to really take the heat for it? Democrats might lose the elections. That's just, this is narrative now. So the US role would be important, but of course the US is also preoccupied. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not on the top of anybody's agenda, right? So you need to put your resources where you really need. This is also true for the region. So the region at this point is not really all that focused on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What they want to do is to fight ISIS. That's what they want to do. They want to deal with the aftermath of the Arab Spring. They want to deal with political Islam. Of course, that is not necessarily bad because it does provide opportunities. So the question becomes, how can we use the opportunity? The opportunity would be, of course, because Israel has an interest too, right? Israel has an interest, just like the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Palestinians in confronting these challenges. So this is a good opportunity for Israel to be inserted into this whole mix and make peace with the region, revive the Arab Peace Initiative and so on. So, why do we look at the domestic environment? Why do we look at domestic dynamics? Because sometimes we do, as analysts, see the opportunity, but then we look at the action of the leaders who are expected to take advantage of that. And we conclude that the domestic constraints prevented them from doing what they were expected to do. So the failure of the previous rounds, the various episodes of war, particularly the Gaza war, I would say, but other episodes of war would certainly be pushing in that scenario that I've mentioned earlier. Israeli settlement expansion would be there too. If Israel goes to elections today and Netanyahu wins again, Well, certainly this would be a very important development in the same direction. It is likely that Palestinian divisions will continue, and that certainly these divisions fuel not necessarily hardline views among Palestinians, but it makes it difficult for Abbas to act in a more rational manner if he has to confront Hamas and have to be more hardline than Hamas in the positions that he takes. The Jerusalem violence that we hear about every day, you did mention something about Jerusalem and the proposed legislation in the Israeli Knesset. Well, that could very well be a reason for greater explosion of violence as well, complicating. If we look at the Israeli and Palestinian, we would then look at the Palestinian and Israeli narratives. You see, that's a challenge. And I really wanted to talk about how I, as a Palestinian, can now tell you the Israeli narrative of why this thing had happened. And I can. And Shai can actually stand up here in front of you and tell you the Palestinian narrative in a way that it would be completely believable. So that's what those 6 or 7 summers have done to us. And then we would go into the analysis, focusing on these issues that I've just mentioned. The regional environment, the preoccupation, the lack of resolve in the White House to use leverage. It would focus on the domestic environment, the turn to the right in Israel, Palestinian divisions, Abbas losing legitimacy as a result of, and popularity as a result of the Gaza war. And it would focus on these 2 individuals, Netanyahu and Abbas. Abbas weakened, unable to take serious risks in the peace process, and Netanyahu forced by his right-wing groups to do nothing. Israeli public opinion and Palestinian public opinion support compromise. Less than they used to in the past, but they still support compromise. If leaders are to, legitimate leaders who are perceived as legitimate, are to push in that direction, they will find that public opinion is not an impediment. You have a panel tomorrow about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the difference between Israeli and Palestinian publics is that while Palestinians are hurting and want to get out of this situation they're in, the Israelis are essentially satisfied with the status quo. So there isn't really any pressure on Netanyahu to deliver peace. In fact, he probably can win without it and might even lose with it, that is, if he decides to take risks. So, Abdelmonem, up to you now to
Thank you.
give a better, more positive.
Now you can open your eyes. I will start by thanking very much the Foreign Policy Research Institute for hosting us. And I will apologize that I can't do 2 functions in the same time, standing up and speaking. So I will, not to mention walking. So that's, I think both Shai and Khalil talked about our experience. It was as hard it is for 6 years, was very enjoyable and sometimes fun, despite of all the frustrations. That goes with anyone who is doing research and trying to do something. I will try to talk a little bit about, what we are trying to do as classroom teachers. I am the least teacher of my colleagues. I don't teach in universities except courses, lectures. But by profession, I am a writer and also a researcher in that sense. So I'm not used to, but I found that teaching to the student a course about the Arab-Israeli conflict is something it's worth it, and that I think helped us very much to get into the approach we took, how to get from our original fields, our people who are working in international relations, to come to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In addition to all our emotions and affiliations, and the three of us fought the wars of the Arab-Israeli conflict, so we got, touching the heat in it. And we were amazed, all of us, why this conflict is very resilient. I mean, its ability, to adjust to all almost global changes that happened in the last more than a century. I mean, the colonization period, decolonization period, Cold War period, post-Cold War American bipolar world. Actually, our dilemma started when we started writing. It was the time in which the world is known, the world in post-September 11th world. So the world each time was changing fundamentally. However, a closer look gives us that there is something going on even despite of all the recurrence of the conflict. That there is something fundamentally changed in the conflict in 1973. That it's moved from existential conflict in which there is total denial of each side to the other side. In Egypt, in the Arab world, we used to say the so-called Israel or the Zionist entity. And there was people in Israel who are talking about who are the Palestinian people. There is no such thing called the Palestinian people. So that kind of denial of the other side, I think that was the most fundamental existential question that made the idea of the removal of the other is very essential. After 1973, we moved into another phase called non-existential conflict, in which we started talking about issues, borders, refugees, Jerusalem, whatever, the history, all of you. These are concrete issues that subject to strategy. I always differentiate between history, which we cannot really control, a lot of variables, and strategy. Strategy in the realm of men and leaders, and in the realm of people who chart future of nations. And plus this change, we have quite not bad an asset. Not only the disengagement agreement, 3 after the 1973, and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, that took 1/4 of the Arab world out of the conflict. And then we have a peace with Jordan. And we have more or less, it took us too long in the Middle East, that's Middle East time. So in the Middle East time, things take too long, but we have a framework for any kind of dreamable negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, building that framework, people who are familiar, and many of the people here got that, can remember if they can make a framework for Rogers' plan, for whatever, negotiation when they meet. Now, we know what we have to do, what kind of decisions to make, and the idea for people, who can think is to find solutions to these issues, which are difficult, but we have done a lot of solutions for more difficult things in the past. I mean, the idea of having 3 areas in Sinai, APC, that was an idea to demilitarize and take Israeli security worries into consideration. When we have a problem with Sinai in Egypt, we raised the call, Mr. Netanyahu, we will put 200 tanks in Sinai. He said, okay, go ahead. We did. We need helicopters there. Okay, we did. So whatever threatening Egypt outside of the deal, because we have peace with Israel, then we can deal with the actual situation in Sinai. Similar things happen with Jordan. Even with the worst people who got always the bad odds in that issues, the Palestinians. We just here all today, we never got a Palestinian political entity of any sort. We got one. And I disagree with Khalil that one time, it will just collapse. It is there and it is there to stay, whether an Israeli government accepts it or not. So we have some changes happening. And as I said, if we took our model, when we started writing the book, we were in the post-September 11th world. And we were in an Arab world that's so static. I mean, the Arab world at the time, the Palestinian Intifada was over, the second Intifada, military one. Everybody was injured in it, the Palestinians, the Israelis. But the Arab world was quite static. When we finished the book, there was a revolution in the Arab world, called sometimes the Arab Spring. So, and when we looked around, the world also changed. The post-September 11th and the American invasion of Iraq and the American invasion of Afghanistan was replaced with a leader who wanted to withdraw from the world, from Iraq and from Afghanistan. And the new American leader named Obama is living through a hell called the international global economic and financial crisis. Did you forget? Did we, all of us, forget 2008 what was happening in the world? So, the world was changing so fast even while we are writing the book. And now we have to tell our students, can we exercise together? Can we exercise together this model of looking at the systemic and the regional and the state level and also the kind of leaders we have and what kind of strategies that we can deal with? One thing I will say, that the world is not as it is even a year ago, after we finished the book publications. I think we have the birth of a different stage in international relations as Russia and the United States are in a problem because of Ukraine, but not because of Syria. It is because of something finally happened in Europe, in which Russia moved forces, and there is something around the reorganization of the world in the post-Cold War era. So we have something. It's not complete yet, but it's a glimpse of something that's happening. Today, we are talking about the regional system in the post-Arab Spring era. So what's happening between the Arab Spring and the post-Arab Spring? A number of important developments. Number one of the development that happened, we have the romantic Arab Spring. The Tahrir Square, flying flags, kids are cleaning the streets and stuff. It didn't take much to find that the Islamic wave is taking over in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, even among the opposition revolutionaries, in Yemen, and we have Shia and Islamists in Bahrain, Sunni, both sides of Islam as a political force is coming under a banner of Muslim Brothers or other banners. And then we didn't finish there. We got more radical Islamists taking a lot of names. The last name, peak of them, the IS. But it's not only the IS. There's Qaeda, there is Nusra, there is Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, and there is some people in the Morocco, Maghreb area. A lot of diversity, all of them. Two things happened in response. One, resurrection of the role of the armies. And the armies not as something against democratization or something. Armies as a modern institution that in many ways the only remaining body in which facing a collapsing state. That is a domestic situation that we have to take it into account. Another last one development is the monarchies. Despite of all that, the monarchists stayed. The monarchists got the will to, when it find chaos will get into Bahrain, is to take arms and get there. Try to manipulate the Syrian conflict, is to support what happened in Egypt after the second or third revolution, it depends how you count, in 2000, last year in June, 2013. So we have the resilience of the monarchies in the region. And finally, the last scene we have now so far in that big saga is the United States Air Force with the air forces of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the Qatar and the other fighting guys. That give us for the first time, for a long time, that the Arab-Israeli conflict can take a breathe, can take a moment to think. A moment to think, because here, if we really looked at a pattern in the conflict, when really we got a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The first time we got it in 1973, it was in the middle of the heat of a battle in which over 6,000 tanks were already into the battlefield on both sides, Israel and the Arab side, when the monarchies with the United States worked with Sadat to get into an agreement. Second time, it was facing Iraq, facing the radicalism of Iraq, facing the radicalism of Saddam Hussein, in which the monarchies and the United States made a war. And during the war, James Baker was moving around in the region, trying to make the framework for the Madrid conference, and then the Oslo process came later out of it, a whole historical process that took most of the 1990s. Now we have a third moment. And I believe, contrary to many pessimists, that coming into the cliff of Islamic radicalism that we are facing right now is making a sobering impact about a number of things. Number one is the issue of the state. That, and I will say it here, borrowing from an article published in Lebanon in the middle of the civil war, in which a writer wrote an article titled Habibati ad-Dawla, My Love, the State. And I think now, whether in Egypt, whether in Libya, whether in many of the countries of the region, it is the issue that the state is very important thing, that chaos and collapsing institution is much more horrifying than any other thing. A second reality that is, it's about time to use a great opportunity that was trying to drag most of the conflicts in the region into the abyss of fanaticism and extremism and take it out from the scene, or at least defeat it. For the first time, Islamists don't have the popularity that they used to have it. When they came to power, they failed. When they finally show that their, I will say, disrespect to the state and thinking of a caliphate and things of that sort, it is really getting the first. Unfortunately, I'm speaking now while the story is still unfolding as we see it. But I see that part of the Middle East is ripe now for a rearrangement of the entire region on a new regional security system, that it has to solve some basic problems that was not resolved for a long period of time, including the Arab-Israeli one. Others are Iraq, others are Syria. These are subject to it will not be easy. And I think, that what we are facing now, but I can't find a scenario in which the United States again will say, I will go home. Because actually what they are seeing, that it will reach the United States, it will reach Europe. It's already catching the United States and Europe in our region. You know, the people who are slaughtered by IS as British or as Americans or as French, there is no something called far away in today's world. So the threat is there, the capability is there, the communication about strategy is taking place, and I think that will give us an opening probably we haven't got before. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks again to our three panelists. We have about a half hour for questions. I'm sure there's a lot. We'll pass around in the back. I have to wait for the mic. Yeah.
First of all, I think what you're doing is fantastic, and I have two really quick little questions that I hope will not distract from my bigger question. The first one is, will you sign our books? Okay? And the second one is, do you have any idea how much this costs?
Yeah, it's about 26, 28. It's on Amazon. It's about 26, I think, but somewhere between 26 and 28.
Awesome. Okay. This is.
And the answer to your first question is yes. We purposefully called the taxi for 6 o'clock so it'll leave us some time to do that.
Thank you. I want to ask a question about the challenge of teaching a balanced and dispassionate course. I mean, that's what we want to do with all of our teaching. But with this particular subject, it's exponentially more difficult. And in order to do that, we have to qualify ourselves. We have to learn. And it takes years and years. And you read, you talk to people, hopefully you go to the region. I think the beauty of this book is that the three narratives here are presented with equal respect and equal truth. I mean, equal as best as we can do that. But in American culture in general, the Israeli narrative has been heard a lot more clearly and pervasively than the Arab or the Palestinian narrative. And so what that means as teachers is that you will, when you present three narratives like this, there will be some, not all, but some, and they're generally quite vocal, who will think, well, no, you're not being balanced, you're being biased against Israel. And I'm wondering, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but I'd be interested in what you have to say about teaching in an environment where what you present as balanced will be seen as biased, maybe in either direction.
Maybe I'll just start by saying that first of all, as you could gather also from what we said, we're very sensitive to what the issue you raised. And actually, at least at some point, and it just happened to be that it happened during half of the semester, this year I'm exceptionally lucky because Abdelmonem and Khalil both coincidentally could give me the entire semester. So usually it's 8 weeks and 8 weeks. Usually we divide the conflict because they could only give me 8 weeks artificially. So we don't follow the textbook because they can't take more than 8 weeks of their very busy schedule. So artificially, we actually divide the conflict between the regional state-to-state dimension, in which Abdelmonem and I are in class every class, and then he goes back to Cairo, Khalil comes, and we do the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of the conflict together in class every class. So it's an artificial division that's dictated by schedules. But so what I'm going to tell you is happened during a few years ago, during the 8 weeks that Khalil and I happened to have been teaching our part of the class. We were actually called in. I have to be careful because I know there's a camera. The camera is rolling. But we were called in to testify to a committee that Brandeis has on quote-unquote teaching sensitive subjects, which has to do with gender, ethnicity, all kinds of things that are sensitive. And the puzzle that we were faced with or challenged by, by that time we've been teaching this class 6, 7 times. how is it that we haven't had a single explosion in 7 years? And we didn't. And again, I think that the key here is what you said yourself, is if you treat these competing narratives with respect, and it's not that we say we respect them, it's by the way we deal with them that they see that we respect them. Now, our classes, because it's Brandeis, our classes, we have Jewish students, a lot of Jewish students, including Orthodox Jewish students, and you may be surprised about Brandeis, we also have Arab students. And in fact, in one of the first classes we taught, we had a female Arab student, Palestinian, Israeli Arab student from the Galilee. And I remember that at that time, for some reason, we had half an hour at the end of the last class to ask students beyond their, evaluations, to discuss with us a little bit, how they felt about the class. And her reaction was very interesting, because she said, this was, for me, she said, this was a class about my identity. Okay, and it's not because we addressed identity, directly and so on. And it's very interesting that because of certain constraints that were on the way she grew up and went through the Israeli education system in an Arab village, where in a sense the Israeli narrative was imposed, she felt, was imposed on her, she resisted until our class to open her ears and eyes to the Israeli narrative. And in some senses, for the first time, because we treated the Arab narrative and the Palestinian narrative with equal respect, she could afford to also hear out the Israeli or the Jewish or the Zionist narrative. And she graduated a semester after she took our class, and then she took her first job in life. And her first job in life after she graduated Brandeis was to work in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Because she wanted to know more. She wanted to know more. And so, the only answer I can give you is that, in fact, we see Arabs and Orthodox Jewish students tolerating our equal treatment of the narratives, and I think that because we treat them equally, and it goes back to the first point I made, it's because they also have a sense that we are not asking them to, in a sense, disabuse themselves from narratives with which they came from home. Okay, because we told them, we disarmed them in the first 15 minutes by saying, we're not going to adjudicate the narratives. We're not going to tell you what's right and what's wrong. So, if you come from home with a very strong, belief in a narrative, in a certain narrative, nothing in our class asks you to abandon your narrative. Okay? The only thing we're asking you is pay attention that the other side also has a narrative.
If I may add something for that question, and first we are sorry to make any teacher will feel difficulty in doing this, and there is a right side of what you said. There is a bias in our book. We are in many ways guilty as charged if we look at it this way. In the United States in general, there is a prevailing story about the Arab-Israeli conflict, that it was heavily to the Israeli-Jewish side. For historical reasons, I didn't want to, So once you have the balance like this, and you have an Arab narrative, and it becomes like this, then you are shifting the balance. And in many ways, you can say that by itself creates a bias into the equation that was settled on a certain level of a balance. But I think in the long run, with the reflection, particularly, the premises of the book, or the three of us, as we participated in the fighting, we participated in the peacemaking as well. I mean, it is not to deepen the conflict, and we have in both sides people who deepen it all the time. I think at the end, the book is trying to make all the parties not only to understand each other, but also to understand the environment. You know, we just heard in the previous lecture, wonderful lecture actually, about, you know, what the British dealt with the issue of how many partitions and issues like that. These were things that's, you know, the international environment is coming to us, and we have to deal with it. And the best way, actually, that comes out of the book, whether the narrative is for or against, is the best way is to sit together and talk. I mean, Oslo happened between the Palestinian and Israelis. The Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty because Sadat went there. I mean, the rest are details. The rest are historical details that are important. I won't neglect them. But I think the big moves happened when we talked with each other.
So I love what you're attempting with the book, with the major developments and then moving to the narratives. But just thinking about what many of us teach, which by our standards must include the U.S. role within this, I'm curious if you have any suggestions for places to look for the narrative of the would-be peacemakers.
That's easy. I mean, okay, it's not that easy. What I meant to say that it's easy or not. So first of all, you're right. This book has a certain inbuilt bias in the sense that that we believe that in the end, the locals have the agency. Now, again, we already said the international system is important and the regional system and so on. But we had to, in a sense, place some limits on this to make it. It was already an unmanageable project, and how we got out of it alive is another puzzle. But we could have, and we considered that to bring a fourth person into this equation, which is to say, which would give the American a side of it, because the Americans have been so central, at least in the last, say, 4 decades. But we decided that's not going to. So yes, there are a few texts, and when I said the problem is that as we put our own syllabus together, the only problem with that is, first of all, so there's some fine texts. Some of them are very, very, very detailed, like Dennis Ross's 859 pages. Some of them are very readable, like David Aaron Miller's The All Too Promised Land, which came before Ali Shavit's My Promised Land. Now the Promised Land has a number of different competing owners. So Aaron Miller actually is the most readable book. It's a very, very readable book about the U.S. role in the peace process and so on. He actually focuses on the fourth level, which is individuals, and the role of the Kissingers, the Jim Bakers, and so on and so forth. It's a more of an impressionistic book, but I think sometimes to convey to students that haven't been involved and maybe have not lived through some of this, actually there's utility in the text that, but my main point is there isn't a single text where you could say, okay, here's where you could read, the definitive history of U.S. involvement in this conflict over the 60 or 70 years. You have to piece together, and you have to make some trade-offs, because as I said, the problem with some of the more detailed accounts is that we can't give it to university students, so you certainly won't be able to give them to high school students. It's just too detailed, and anyway.
I was fascinated to hear what you have to say, because as it happens, I taught myself a course on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict at Brandeis for 16 years, between 1980 and 1996, long before you were born.
I wish.
Now, and I was struck by the difference in approach, because I adopted the approach, and I'm not saying it's better or worse than yours, it was different. My approach as an old-fashioned conventional historian was an evidence-based approach. Of course, we looked at narratives, but we also, I tried to encourage the students to arrive at conclusions. And I just want to ask you whether you think there's this is not a criticism of what you're saying, but I just want to ask you whether you think there might be a danger in saying that all narratives are equal. I don't think you're quite saying that, but is there a danger that the students might come out of this thinking all narratives are equal? There are 100 ways of looking at it, and not arriving at conclusions.
Do you want to? I don't want to dominate this, but when I came to the conclusion to the narrative section, I said that it's not quite exactly as I said it in the following way. First of all, we're not saying that all narratives are equal. The only thing we're saying is that all narratives are equally legitimate. Okay. Secondly, when I said, where I kind of played a little trick on all of you, to be completely candid, is when I said we are disarming the students and therefore avoiding these explosions by saying we're not going to adjudicate these narratives. It's not entirely true. The reason I say it's not entirely true is because when we provide them with this toolbox, we provide them with an analytical framework to understand why what happened happened. They can take that analytical framework and compare their results when applying this analytical framework with the narratives. So they can actually for themselves, based on this analytical framework, they can basically judge for themselves who in their views narrative is closer to what you might call reality, okay? So although we're basically telling them we're not going to tell you which narrative is closer to another, we're actually giving them the tools to do some of that, but we're keeping their eyes and ears open by giving them a convincing story that we're not doing that. That we're not telling them which one is more legitimate than the other. And frankly, because, because as we discovered, again, some of my best friends are historians, so it's okay, it's okay. But when you say facts-based, yes, but evidence-based. But the problem is that what is even presented as evidence, so just a few sessions ago, not your session, a session before that, we heard that there's a new wave of research about the refugees issue, and so on and so forth. And this new research says so and so, and that gives us a new picture of, what happened in 1948 and so on and so forth. And if it's not Benny Morris, then whose new research is it? Probably Ilan Pape. Okay, so is that, isn't that in dispute? It's disputed by everybody. So the problem of what constitutes evidence is a big issue.
We're not interested in changing anybody's mind. In the classroom, we are hoping that students will indeed make up their own mind. We give them assignments in which we ask them to get into the exercise of making their own mind, taking events, analyzing them, because we have given them the tools. And reading the narratives by itself isn't really all that helpful in helping them make up their minds. The analysis is a lot more important. The narratives are essentially ways in which we challenge them to consider whatever stereotypes they already have, whatever positions they had heard at home, or in the media, so that at least they become open to the idea that this is a question that requires analysis, serious academic analysis, and that when they decide that they want to make up their mind, that they want to take a position, that they have to do it the hard way, which is through the analysis, not through narratives of someone here or there. So when you always put two or more narratives together, obviously there is that question, and the question that was raised earlier about are you giving legitimacy to the other narrative? Well, if you're deeply committed to the cause, if you believe this is just and right and the other side is absolutely wrong, if you believe in that, then obviously if you're challenged with another narrative, you want to dismiss it. You don't want to open your eyes and read it. So then we're not in a synagogue, we're not in a mosque, we're not in a church, we are in a university. That's what we must do. That's and this is true for schools as well. This is where there has to be a confrontation, where students are encouraged to reconsider and to challenge themselves.
If I may add something here, because there is Bernard put his hand on, the difference between historians and political science in tackling the same issue. And I guess he's right, can we make all the narratives equal in the sense that, relativism is something, some political trends and ideas see it as a way of going beyond morality, that there is nothing so-called that evidence is always, there, that there is nothing called a woman that's half pregnant. It is either pregnant or not pregnant. So there is a truth is possible, and there is a philosophical debate here. And I will try to put it in a form that we might agree on. Actually, what's equal we have are the people who are behind the narrative. I mean, the people of the Middle East deserve the right to tell their story. Being this story is wrong or right or deficient or not enough, because some of it's unresolvable. One important thing in the Jewish psyche is the idea of the few against the many. One big thing in the Arab psyche is the many, that the few, powerful few, 5,000 British soldiers, controlled India for a long period of time. So if you have a few that are strong, technologically advanced and stuff like this, they can be very, very, vicious, and they can control the many. So you have here the few and the many, the same kind of an equation, but it is the historical experience of the people and their own traditions and how they face it over generations. A country like Egypt, for instance, that for 3,000 years was occupied by somebody else. Don't feel guilty. I mean, the British came later, came to the end, and 70 years, what is that? Was the Turks, 500 years. So, sometimes, that issue, take the issue of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is quite very deep, I think, for human history, and for the Jews in particular. An Arab will say, I didn't do it. So here, history works that's not my problem as a political science. The title of the book is Conflict and Peacemaking. So here how we deal with something that has been chasing our nations for generations and to come to grips with it. Others did it in Europe, between the French and the Germans and the others, a lot of revision and getting into the whole spectrum of perceptions into the issue. And perception by itself, it is not fact and evidence-based, except to have evidence that there is a perception. And we are sure 100% that we have a lot of evidence that tell us in newspapers, in leaders' speeches, in Knessets and parliaments, things that tell us that the story we put in this book are the story that's told in the ground in the level of political interaction.
We have about 10 minutes left, so to just maybe get to questions and possible answers, short so that we get as many in as possible.
No, just we tried to preempt some questions by giving more answers.
No, please, it's been excellent.
I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about what goes on inside the classroom. If you guys are emphasizing more of the toolbox, or if you're emphasizing more of the narrative. What in the time in class? What are you talking with the students? How does that class run? Are the students balancing the narratives themselves, or what do you push students to think? And what have you found that you'd want students to, for students that you have, what are they weak in that we as high school teachers could try to maybe prepare them for when they try to get into hopefully a classroom like yours?
Not all classes are equal. In some classes, we do what we want to do. In other classes, we lose control. And
In most classes.
in most classes, you're absolutely right. So we hope to give equal treatment to all issues, but we're also interested in teaching. We're interested in making sure that students have read and that they are able to interact with us. Our style is not, at least not all of us, is not lecturing, but rather to make sure that the students are able to interact with us, take advantage of the fact that the three of us are there and read the material. And so we do our best to try and question the students. And that takes a lot of time, and it depends on whether the students have done the reading, haven't done the reading. So it isn't really, what we hope to do is something we're most of the time, as Shai said, unable to do. But as we recognize deficits here and there, we try to compensate in future lectures.
One more really quick question.
Our students live in Marshall McLuhan's world. They are constantly bombarded with media, and the nature of media about your subject is radical. Do you have suggestions for how we can help our students to develop some sense of discrimination which would lead them to be able to deal with your toolbox to identify those narratives that are not necessarily all legitimate, all worthy of consideration, and in particular, how they can identify those elements of media, of narrative, and of education on the ground in your region that is in need of some exploration and perhaps questioning?
Actually, in the first class, we actually mentioned exactly what you said, which is to say that and that focuses on the toolbox, because the promise that we make, or at least I make irresponsibly to the students, is that the utility of this class is not to come out from this class with gigantic amount of data or information that they don't have. It's not possible to do it in this kind of a class. And therefore, as I said, I think that it's the sensitivity on one side, so in a sense it's a sensitivity production exercise. And the second is the toolbox, because when I present the toolbox, I say to them something along the lines, just using different words than what you said in your question, which is to say, what we want you to be able to, if 6 months from now, you open the TV, okay, and you hear that so and so and so, or you, God forbid, open the New York Times and hear that something happened and so on and so forth. Here's the toolbox. That toolbox should be of utility to you when you face this media bombardment. And you're right about the bombardment, because when something dramatic happens in the region, then you won't see it once on CNN. You'll see it on a certain cycle 16 times on CNN. So the toolbox is exactly again, in the exercise of trying to sort out, what's narrative and what's not narrative.
Brandeis is not that radical, by the way, so our life is a bit easier.
But because if you can you give me one more minute? I really want to go back to one dimension of your question because it's such an important question. Because it really comes to the heart of this differentiation between, in a sense, narrative and analysis. And here I want to kind of, in a way, challenge you, because I think that, and I speak only for myself, because here I'm kind of going beyond any agreed consensus. I actually think that there are issues that, in principle, can be resolved by evidence. And I think that there are issues that have to do with these competing narratives that no evidence can resolve. So here's my two very extreme examples. So one night, because Abdelmonem already mentioned that we are also activists, because we've been involved, we've been in the trenches of we've been actually in the trenches on the military side too, but we were also in the trenches of the peacemaking effort. So, without naming names, so one night after a whole day of conversations that I had the privilege to take part in, and it's been a few years ago, so I can maybe safely tell you about this. So I was in one of the European countries, and we were in one of those informal conversations with our cousins from the region, and some of them former senior military people. And after all this, that particular working evening was over, I found myself in the bar of the hotel where this was taking place with a very, very, very senior former Egyptian security person and his Jordanian counterpart and myself. And for about an hour and a half, they tried to convince me. They gave me a very, very, very well built, brick by brick analysis, which actually narrative, to persuade me that Monica Lewinsky was a Mossad agent. Now, this in principle can be resolved by evidence. Okay? But I would submit to you that the competing Israeli-Palestinian narratives about the role of the British cannot be determined by evidence. Because if you look at all the evidence that we've looked at, actually there is enough evidence for both sides to build a very convincing argument. The Zionist side, that it's a story of betrayal. The Palestinian side, that without the British, the Zionist movement would not have had institutions and would not have self-defense forces, which are the two most important ingredients that prepared them for statehood. So no body of evidence can resolve the gap between these two narratives.
Okay, on that happy note.